Welcome to the polished cage of Victorian womanhood, where your worth is measured in posture, patience, and how well you fake a blush. You were trained to smile through childbirth, flirt without speaking, and host dinner like your marriage depended on the soup. This wasn't a life. It was a lifelong audition you didn't know you were in, and just when you survive giving birth, they expect you to look radiant by supper. If you enjoy falling asleep to strange, fascinating stories from the past, hit that like button and subscribe for more delightfully dark bedtime tales. This episode is part of our Victorian series, a cosy collection of bedtime stories exploring the most bizarre, baffling and quietly exhausting lives of the 19th century. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because there's something oddly soothing about drifting off to tales of dinner party diplomacy, arsenic-laced beauty, and the endless performance of being a proper woman. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and slip into a world where perfection was mandatory, and survival came with a smile, a curtsy, and a very tight corset. You wake to the familiar sound of someone else doing the hard part of your life, specifically the maid. She's hauling coals into your fireplace like a soot-covered goblin with a spine condition. You lock eyes for half a second. She's been up for 3 hours, you've been awake for 3 seconds. You both silently agree that she hates you. Your bedroom is freezing, which is of course fashionable. A lady should wake up chilled, ethereal, and on the brink of respiratory illness. It keeps the cheeks pink and the mortality rate high. You curl your toes under the covers to delay your inevitable transformation from sleeping girl to marriageable asset. But your mother is already calling your name through the door, the same way a horse trainer calls a skittish mare to the paddock. Time to get beautiful. And in Victorian England, beautiful translates roughly to pale, fainting, and medically inadvisable. Step 1. Splash your face with rose water that's been steeped in vinegar, ammonia, and regret. Step 2. Apply a light dusting of arsenic powder, because nothing says, "I'm ready for marriage," like luminous skin and irreversible organ damage. Step 3. Belladonna eye drops, which make your pupils enormous and your vision non-existent. But that's fine. You're not expected to read anything anyway. The maid, Martha, long-suffering and silently judgmental, brings you your corset. You hold the bedpost. She pulls the laces. You gasp. She pulls harder. Somewhere in your chest a rib cracks like a wet twig. Good. That means it's working. You now have the waist of a child and the lung capacity of a Victorian child with consumption. Your mother peeks in to say you look fresh. You can't respond because speaking requires oxygen. Martha hands you your boots. You attempt to balance and nearly topple over like a distressed mannequin. She watches this without intervening, because the class system dictates she can scrub your chamber pot, but not your dignity off the floor. The dress goes on next. 18 buttons, none of which you can reach. Martha fastens them while you stare at the wall and reflect on the fact that you've spent your entire life preparing to be handed off like a limited edition porcelain doll to a man with a house, a job, and preferably no visible boils. Once fully dressed, you waddle to the mirror. You look like you've emerged from a fainting couch and are headed straight back toward one. Perfect. Downstairs, your mother is waiting, armed with unsolicited advice and a general air of disappointment. She adjusts your gloves and reminds you, again, that ladies do not stride, they glide. You're not entirely sure what that means, but you nod, because that's the appropriate amount of resistance for someone who depends on her parents for everything, including survival. You smile. You're pale, polished, and fully prepared to spend the next 10 years pretending you don't have an opinion. Congratulations, you're a Victorian woman. Victorian femininity was less about personality and more about packaging. For the genteel woman, raised in drawing rooms, not workhouses, beauty wasn't optional. It was social currency, marriage bait, and a public service. Complexions were carefully cultivated through powders made from arsenic, chalk, and lead, sold in elegant tins that conveniently left out the word fatal. Belladonna eye drops derived from deadly nightshade were advertised to widen the pupils and make the eyes appear languid. The side effects included blurred vision, permanent eye damage, and occasional cardiac arrest. But then again, what is romance without risk? Corsets reduced waist to 18 or 19 inches and were worn from childhood onward, gradually trading lung function for elegance. Doctors warned against the internal organ displacement caused by tight lacing, but these warnings often appeared next to corset advertisements, sandwiched between testimonials about how flattering they were at funerals. Real women weren't silent about it. They were just ignored. A letter published anonymously in the English Woman's Domestic Magazine in 1868 read, "I faint daily and cannot eat, but my waist has pleased my aunt who says I am nearly ready for a proposal." That, in essence, was the job interview, and once you looked the part, powdered, pinched and properly oxygen deprived, you were permitted to leave the house and be quietly evaluated like produce. The corset was only the beginning. The next step came with steel hoops, fire hazards, and the constant cheerful threat of public collapse. Your walking corset is supposed to be more flexible than your indoor corset. This is like saying a guillotine is more comfortable than a bear trap because it comes with a ribbon. You hold the bedpost while Martha pulls the laces, and you're pretty sure your spine files for emancipation somewhere around the third tug. Then comes the crinoline, a charming cage made of steel hoops and humiliation. You step into it like it might bite, which, to be fair, it has. Your leg still bears the scar from the last time it snapped closed like a gentleman's jaw at a suffragette rally. Once the structure is in place, Martha begins layering on fabric with the casual speed of someone unbothered by gravity. There's muslin, taffeta, starch, tulle, and a final overskirt made of what you're told is French silk, though it feels suspiciously like a tablecloth that got into finishing school. You now measure 4 feet in diameter and can no longer fit through the front door without rotating sideways like an expensive wagon. Your mother glides in, surveys your silhouette and nods. "Perfect," she says, as if you've been successfully stuffed and mounted. You sit briefly, then immediately regret it. The crinoline doesn't bend, it folds, sending your knees somewhere north of your chin and launching the back of your skirt into the air like a theatrical curtain. Martha rushes over to help flatten your dignity. Now comes the hat. It is, by all appearances, a miniature bird graveyard affixed to a velvet plate. There is also a parasol which you will carry but not open, because it's for looking shady, not creating shade. When you finally step outside, you move with the grace of a sailboat trying to navigate a parlour. A light breeze catches your skirts and nearly lifts you like a bridal kite. You grab a lamppost. Your mother pretends not to see. This is what it means to be respectable, barely mobile, constantly monitored, and dressed like you're one strong gust away from airborne courtship. Crinolines were introduced in the mid-1800s as a modern solution to voluminous skirts. The goal was to maintain a fashionable silhouette while relieving women of the weight of multiple petticoats. In reality, crinolines replaced bulk with width and danger. Made of horsehair, steel or whalebone hoops, they could span up to 6 feet across, depending on your commitment to dying with dignity. While corsets squeezed the waist, the crinoline exploded outward, creating the hourglass shape so aggressively idealized by the era. This structure also made navigating stairs, doors, and entire households an ongoing strategic nightmare. More than once, women caught fire when their skirts brushed too close to open hearths, a common household feature. The Illustrated London News reported in 1864 that over 2,500 women had died in crinoline fires in a single year. A quote from the Times described a young woman in Brighton whose crinoline burst into flame and consumed her garments in moments, while her parents stood powerless to assist. Crinolines were also a weapon of social exclusion. Poorer women couldn't afford the materials or the tailoring, which meant the silhouette itself became a class signal, a literal barrier of steel and fabric that separated you from physical labour, personal space, and lower status. The corset, meanwhile, was considered the foundation of femininity. Doctors warned against it, religious leaders scolded about vanity, and women wore them anyway, not just for beauty, but because undergarment rebellion was rarely worth social exile. In 1859, a writer for the Ladies' Companion explained, "To be laced tightly is not a vanity, but a virtue. It teaches a woman discipline, silence, and the modesty of restraint." Discipline, silence, restraint. all qualities admired in upholstery, horses, and wives. And yet once a woman was properly cinched and caged, she could begin the serious business of attracting a husband, usually by existing nearby and not falling down. Public outings were theatre. The audience was male, the costume was suffocating, and the curtain was always rising. As your mother adjusts your skirt with practiced precision, she reminds you to keep your parasol slightly tilted. Not for sun, but to frame your face. You nod because nodding is the only motion you're still allowed to perform without assistance. The maid closes the door behind you, careful not to crush the hem. You're going for a walk, and it will require the core strength of a ballerina and the patience of a prisoner. You're not just a girl in a dress. You're a walking billboard for your family's ambition. One steel hoop at a time. Your morning walk is not, as your mother calls it, a delightful airing. It is an unpaid audition for a husband. You're dressed like a cake stand and walking like an apology. Martha has already ironed the pleats in your skirt so sharply you could slice bread with them. Your mother inspects you one last time, straightens a bow and murmurs shoulders back, as if you're about to meet the firing squad. The park is full of other girls just like you, pastel-coloured chess pieces being moved by their mothers across gravel paths. Nobody's here for exercise. You're here to demonstrate that you can stroll slowly without sweating, breathing loudly, or making eye contact with the wrong person. It's less romantic promenade and more cattle show with better hats. To your left, a girl glides by with a hem half an inch longer than yours. Your mother notices instantly. Such modesty, she whispers, eyes narrowing. No wonder she's still unwed. You nod, because speaking would use oxygen you'll need for fainting later, and there he is, Mr. Edward Blackwood, the man your mother's been hinting about since breakfast. He's 30, solvent, and already examining you like he's trying to guess your price per pound. He bows, you curtsy. Both of you look like you're being mildly punished. Lovely day, you say, because it's either that or scream. Indeed, he replies, eyes fixed just left of your dowry. He asks if you read. You laugh lightly, the delicate tinkle of a woman who's very familiar with Tolstoy, but will die before admitting it. Only a little, you say, which is Victorian for, I have opinions, but I value survival. He seems pleased. The last thing any respectable man wants is a wife who can quote Plato before pudding. You walk side by side, chaperones trailing like prison guards. You talk about the weather, the park, the state of the gravel. You brush hands once by accident, and 3 old women nearly faint with excitement. By the time you return home, your mother's eyes are sparkling. She says words like promising match and excellent connections. You say words like and yes, and wonder if it's socially acceptable to marry a spaniel. In the Victorian middle and upper middle classes, marriage wasn't just personal, it was economic survival. For daughters who couldn't inherit property, wages, or legal autonomy, marrying well was less about romance and more about avoiding slow ruin. It was your career, your social security plan, and your final exam all rolled into one tightly corseted performance. Courtship was a choreographed negotiation. Families arranged introductions through mutual acquaintances, and interactions were heavily monitored. A woman's reputation could be shattered by something as minor as unaccompanied conversation or, heaven forbid, visible enthusiasm. Etiquette manuals were filled with helpful warnings like, a young lady should never speak too animatedly in the presence of a gentleman. Intelligence, though admirable, may suggest an unsettling independence. The stakes were high, especially for women with few siblings or modest dowries. The Illustrated London News frequently featured reports on marriages that elevated entire families, or collapsed them. One 1854 article detailed how a single engagement between a draper's daughter and a wealthy banker's son allowed her family to retire to Surrey and her younger sister to marry upward the following year. Husbands, in turn, gained a well-trained domestic manager, a symbol of respectability, and, ideally, a fertile womb. Love, while occasionally tolerated, was not required. Women were expected to be pleasant but unthreatening, cultured but not opinionated, educated but only in embroidery and seasonal fruit. A man was encouraged to choose a wife who was healthy, graceful, and entirely devoid of ambition. The idea was to secure a partner who would quietly assist him, like a tasteful umbrella that could also bear children. A woman who failed to marry was deemed a spinster, a term originally referring to someone who spun thread, but which evolved into shorthand for forgotten. These women were often treated as pitiable relics, despite many having richer intellectual lives and greater independence than their married peers. So you walked in the park, you took tea, you looked agreeable, and if you were lucky or strategic, you secured a husband who didn't gamble excessively or die of syphilis before the wedding. One who could be tolerated, maybe even liked, and if not, you could always try again next season, with a new hat, a better smile, and a mother slightly closer to desperation. After all, next time there might be dancing, and dancing meant gloves, and gloves meant hand-touching, and that, in Victorian terms, was practically second base. Your honeymoon is over, and by honeymoon you mean the 30 seconds between "I do" and "here's your household budget." Instead of strolling through rose gardens in a new life of leisure, you're being marched through the pantry like a junior officer on her first inspection. You're no longer a daughter, you're a mistress of the household, which sounds glamorous until you realise it's basically unpaid project management with a hat. Today's agenda includes beef inventory, coal tallies, and pretending you know the difference between goose fat and dripping. Spoiler, you don't. The housekeeper, Mrs. Parker, introduces you to your kingdom with the cheer of a grave digger. "This is the silver pantry," she intones, showing you a cupboard that looks like a dragon hoard of spoons. "This is the scullery." You nod wisely, as if you've ever scullered anything in your life. Next comes the staff. The cook glares at you like you're about to suggest cinnamon in beef stew. The parlour-maid curtsies so fast you're not sure if she's greeting you or bracing for impact. The scullery maid is a child who looks like she's been 50 for 10 years. You smile at them all with a brittle grin of a woman who has been told she's in charge but suspects everyone knows better. By lunchtime you've approved a pudding you didn't taste, authorised a delivery you don't understand, and supervised linens you can't tell apart. You've also discovered a new skill: weeping silently behind a cupboard while maintaining perfect posture. Your mother once said a lady's home is her castle. You're starting to realise you're not the queen. You're the unpaid steward with the keys, tasked with keeping the drawbridge spotless and the moat properly flavoured with rosewater. For a Victorian woman of the genteel class, marriage did not signal retirement into leisure. It marked the beginning of constant logistical labour hidden behind decorum. A well-run household was a reflection of her worth, even if she didn't boil the potatoes herself. The role of a middle or upper-middle-class wife involved managing a small army of servants, monitoring household accounts, overseeing meal schedules, arranging flowers, preserving linens, and ensuring her children were fed, clothed, and morally terrified. She was expected to be everywhere and nowhere, omnipresent but never sweaty. Victorian household manuals like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management offered thousands of pages of advice for how to maintain respectability through perfect puddings and spotless servants. Mrs. Beeton famously wrote, "A mistress must conduct herself with quiet dignity, yet be firm and decisive. Let her countenance express cheerfulness rather than severity. A sour expression has lost many a mistress the respect of her staff," which is a polite way of saying, smile while you drown. A genteel wife typically rose early to plan meals with the cook and to inspect the morning delivery of meats, fish, or baked goods. She might spend hours corresponding with tradesmen, writing thank you notes, arranging flowers for the drawing room, or checking that the laundry hadn't turned her husband's shirt into a pink scandal. She was also expected to plan entertainments, manage household repairs, and coach the children's moral development, all while remaining delicate, attractive, and not visibly exhausted. Any failure in domestic elegance could suggest moral failing, and reflect badly on her husband, of course. Women wrote candidly about this double burden in diaries and letters. One young wife, quoted in an 1871 issue of The Queen, confessed, "I spend my days instructing the cook not to poison us, calming the nursemaid, and trying to recall if gooseberries are in season. My husband thanks me for the tidy parlour, but not for the invisible battle it required. And so, domestic life became a daily performance. You didn't just run a house, you ran a brand that served lemon sponge at just the right hour, sent the best handwritten regrets, and never once let on that the entire system ran on tea, lies, and quiet despair. Still you nod. You nod through pudding decisions, oil orders, and laundry tallies. You nod because if you stop nodding, someone might notice you haven't sat down in 2 days, and besides, dinner is in 3 hours, and the pudding must be perfect. It's Tuesday, which means tea with the clergyman, embroidery by the window, and, surprise, your uterus staging another unsanctioned protest. You feel the familiar cramp and do the polite Victorian thing. Smile, excuse yourself, and scurry upstairs like a criminal caught with contraband. Because that's what menstruation is here. Evidence of moral weakness, to be hidden in a linen drawer between the guest napkins and your last shred of dignity. There's no feminine hygiene aisle. There's just a stack of folded cloths you launder in secret, praying no one notices. Pain relief. You have 2 options. Opium, which turns you into a cheerful ghost, or vinegar compresses, which make you smell like a salad. You choose neither, because your hosting tea and fainting dramatically in front of the vicar is still considered bad manners. You lie on your side, curled like a question mark, corset digging into your ribs, thinking how extraordinary it is to be both considered delicate and expected to endure pain like a cavalry horse. You can't cry, tears stain the arsenic powder, you can't complain, complaint is vulgar. So you simply get up, pat your skirts, and practice the universal Victorian skill of looking serene while bleeding out. And of course, if you're married, everyone assumes menstruation is over and motherhood has begun. Your body becomes a public project, a quiet incubator everyone comments on but no one helps with. The house buzzes with whispered speculation about when you'll start a family, as though babies arrive by subscription box and you're just late with your order. If you do conceive, congratulations. You've won a 9-month endurance test with no instructions, no scans, no vitamins, and a midwife whose primary credential appears to be has hands. And if you lose the pregnancy, that's not a tragedy, that's a sadness, which you're expected to handle between soup courses. So you return to the parlour. The clergyman remarks on the weather. You smile politely and sip your tea, the perfect picture of virtue, all while thinking, if he knew what was happening under this crinoline, he'd spill his own. In Victorian society, a woman's relationship with her body was dictated entirely by how well she could hide it. Menstruation, pregnancy, miscarriage, and menopause were considered impolite subjects, not because they were rare, but because they were unavoidable and therefore unspeakable. Middle and upper-class women used homemade menstrual cloths, which they washed in private and dried discreetly, often behind other laundry to avoid scandal. Many products were simply referred to as ladies' items in catalogues and newspapers, with euphemisms like sanitary conveniences or necessary cloths. To even mention menstruation by name was considered vulgar, an act that could end a dinner invitation. Pain relief was minimal. Some women used laudanum, opium tincture, for severe cramps, while others were advised to apply vinegar compresses or simply lie still and think of gentle things. A particularly cruel passage from the Ladies' Monthly Museum advised, menstruation is the reminder of Eve's error. One must endure it with humility, not complaint. Pregnancy, despite being celebrated in theory, was not considered a subject for public discussion. Women were expected to remain socially visible until their condition was too obvious, at which point they were sequestered, either from shame, superstition, or aesthetic discomfort. Prenatal care was nearly non-existent. Midwives often had little formal training, and maternal mortality was high, especially from puerperal fever, a deadly postpartum infection. Doctors were just beginning to understand germ theory, but hand-washing between deliveries remained disturbingly optional. Miscarriage was treated as a private tragedy with no medical protocol and even less emotional support. Most women were expected to recover quietly and carry on, with minimal acknowledgement from husbands or physicians. It was seen as a woman's burden, not a medical emergency. The 1858 diary of one Mrs. H. Featherstone contains this quiet note. Felt unwell. sent for vinegar cloth. The pain worse than last time. No one must know. Put the sheets to boil before dinner guests arrived. This was the reality for many Victorian women, expected to carry the emotional and physical weight of their reproductive lives while remaining cheerful, quiet, and extremely well-scented. But of course, a lady never dwells on such things. She simply smooths her skirts, adjusts her corset, and descends the stairs with a polite smile, ready to ask the cook about tonight's roast. Because womanhood, after all, is mostly just good hosting with a side of internal bleeding. And tomorrow your mother-in-law will visit. She'll bring soup, criticism, and her thoughts on how long is too long to wait before producing a proper heir. You'll smile, sip tea, and try not to scream when the baby kicks. Tea time, the most dangerous hour of the Victorian day. You've polished the silver, arranged the napkins, and threatened the maid into stacking the cucumber sandwiches like architectural models. Everything is perfect, which is exactly how you know you're about to be psychologically mauled by 3 women in pastel. Mrs. Davenport arrives first, trailing expensive perfume and barely concealed contempt. She kisses your cheek like she's marking her territory. "Darling, you look so rested," she says, which in tea language means you look ill and I'm enjoying it immensely. Miss Wilkins follows, pursed lips and pursed womb. She warns you, again, not to cross your legs lest your future child be born sideways. You thank her politely and imagine hitting her with the sugar tongs. Lady Elmsby doesn't speak. She just floats in like death in a bonnet, glances at your drapes, and makes a small noise in her throat. It could mean anything. That's what makes it terrifying. You pour tea. Your hands shake slightly, not from nerves, and just from wearing a corset tight enough to qualify as structural engineering. You ask if anyone would like sugar, and Mrs. Davenport says, "Oh, none for me. I find too much sweetness ruins the flavour." She is, of course, talking about you. The conversation begins as a gentle breeze and quickly sharpens into a hurricane of veiled threats and weaponized compliments. Someone mentions your neighbour's daughter got engaged. To a barrister, they say, as if she's just contracted a rash. "She's not very refined," Mrs. Davenport whispers, sipping her tea like it's laced with holy water. You laugh softly, nod thoughtfully, and die a little inside. Because this isn't tea. This is a tactical operation conducted with doilies and lemon sponge. Every smile is loaded. Every comment is a trap. Every biscuit has been judged by at least 4 women before it reaches your mouth. And you're the hostess, which means you're the battlefield, the referee, and the likely casualty. Afternoon tea in Victorian society was both a ritual and a weapon. For women of the genteel class, it was one of the few semi-public arenas where they could build alliances, gauge social standing, and launch character assassinations, all while maintaining the illusion of ladylike sweetness. A proper tea required meticulous etiquette, correct placement of the teapot, cream before sugar, dainty bites of cake, and the ability to smile while delivering or enduring savage verbal evisceration. No subject was ever addressed directly. Gossip wore lace gloves. A lady might say, "What a curious arrangement she's made with her maid," which could mean anything from "she's being robbed blind" to "their lovers and I have receipts." Social status was endlessly negotiated in these spaces. Hosting a successful tea, with the right china, the right refreshments and the right kind of guests, could elevate your standing for weeks. A poorly executed one could trigger whispered campaigns that might last years. Women were trained from a young age to observe everything and express nothing plainly. Emotional restraint was a badge of honour. As the Lady's Companion advised in 1862, a woman's tongue may destroy what her husband builds. Let her choose her words as she would her jewels, sparingly and only when properly polished. Reputation was fragile. The wrong friendship, the wrong remark, or even the wrong hem length could spark a social unravelling. And because women could not inherit, vote, or work respectably outside the home, reputation was often the only power they truly held. The parlour was the battlefield. The weapon, a sideways glance. The casualty, the woman who wore last season's trim or dared to host without enough lemon biscuits. And so, you pour the tea, smile politely, and memorize every veiled jab and backhanded compliment. Because next week, You'll be the guest, and what you say might determine whether you're remembered as charming, common, or tragically unwell. And next time it won't be tea, it'll be dinner with your in-laws. And they don't gossip, they interrogate. You're hosting dinner tonight, which in your new life as a Victorian wife translates to, "Welcome to your performance review, now served with gravy." Your mother-in-law is attending, which means everything in the house, including your facial expressions, must be ironed, symmetrical, and absolutely free of scent. She arrives 5 minutes early, of course, because punctuality is how she asserts dominance. She removes her gloves like she's about to duel someone, gives you a look that suggests your hairstyle is both modern and personally offensive, and says, "Well, you've certainly made an effort, which is Victorian for, 'I came to destroy you.' Dinner must impress. The soup must not be too hot, the roast must not be too dry, and the pudding must not wobble suggestively. You've spent all day giving the cook vague instructions like appropriate firmness and a sauce that won't provoke comment. You are, in essence, trying to create a meal that tastes like marital stability. You've assigned seating strategically. Your father-in-law by the fireplace, he's half deaf. Your mother-in-law by the smartest person you could find, the vicar's wife who once read Latin out loud, and yourself at the opposite end of the table where you can smile from a safe distance. You refill wine glasses like a hostage offering concessions. Your husband, of course, does nothing. He says splendid when the fish arrives and delightful when the pudding doesn't collapse, and somehow this counts as participation. Meanwhile, you've burned your tongue on the consommé, nodded through 3 critiques of your wallpaper, and silently mouthed, "I hate everything," into your spoon. By the end of the evening no one has died, cried or insulted your napkin folding out loud. This is considered a victory. Your husband tells you you've done beautifully. You smile like a woman who has just passed an exam she didn't study for in a subject she didn't choose. In Victorian England, a good wife was not a person. She was a position, 1 part hostess, 1 part ornament, and 1 part unpaid emotional labourer. Her job was to reflect well on her husband, soothe his anxieties, run his home, charm his guests, manage his meals, raise his heirs, and disappear into the wallpaper during moments of male conversation. Hosting dinner was one of her highest public duties. The expectations were absurdly precise. Soup had to arrive at the correct temperature. Meat had to be cut just so. The wrong wine pairing could stain a woman's reputation, metaphorically and sometimes literally. According to Cassell's Household Guide, 1876, a lady of quality must ensure her table is set with delicacy and taste, her conversation graceful but restrained, and her guests in harmony. Her husband's reputation rests upon her invisible efforts. In-laws, particularly mothers, wielded enormous influence. A mother-in-law could subtly sabotage a marriage with enough raised eyebrows and whispered questions about your gravy technique. Women were expected to accept this as part of the delicate balancing act of marital diplomacy. Failure to perform one's domestic role to perfection could result in quiet ostracization. A single burned pudding or overly outspoken opinion could follow a woman for seasons, appearing in tea-room whispers and folded fan gestures. And because divorce was scandalous and rare, most women suffered silently and adjusted their soufflés. Private diaries from the time reveal how exhausting this performance could be. One wife wrote in 1869, "I smiled so long at Mrs. H. that my jaw locked. The blancmange refused to set. The maid wept into the lamb. My husband called it a splendid evening." And still, the next morning she would rise early to plan breakfast, review the flour order, and send polite thank you notes to people who had criticised her cutlery. Because being a wife wasn't about love, it was about survival. 1 lace tablecloth, an acceptable roast at a time. And if you managed all of that with grace, restraint, and just enough lavender perfume to avoid suspicion, you might even be asked to host again, unless, of course, your sister-in-law shows up. And she always does, with newer gloves and opinions about the meringue. Confinement, what a word. It makes it sound like you're being gently tucked away to sip broth and knit tiny booties. In reality, it's just house arrest with contractions. You're not allowed outside, you're not allowed excitement, and you're certainly not allowed to say out loud that. You're terrified. This is preparing for motherhood in the same way sitting in a locked cellar prepares you for a hurricane. The midwife arrives, a brisk woman who smells of cloves and judgment. She looks you over like she's appraising livestock, mutters something about sturdy hips, and starts arranging towels as if they're going to save you. She encourages you to breathe gently, which is a charming suggestion to make to someone about to attempt pushing a watermelon through a sewing thimble. There's no chloroform for you, not unless you're royalty or scandalous enough to demand it. Your options are vinegar rags, biting down on linen, or simply rebranding screaming as expressive prayer. You choose silence, mostly because you've been trained since girlhood to treat pain like an unseemly hobby. Hours pass, time loses meaning. You've entered a new realm where your only companions are a candle, the midwife's clucking tongue, and the increasingly clear suspicion that you're about to meet your ancestors. Finally you hear a cry, not yours but a baby's. You're handed a damp, outraged infant who immediately yells with the kind of freedom you've been denied for the last 9 hours. Everyone congratulates you. You're now a mother, which is Victorian for someone who will be expected to smile, host visitors, and resume managing the household before she can sit without wincing. You nod faintly and think, at least the baby's allowed to scream. Victorian childbirth was a spectacle of silent suffering and spectacular misunderstanding. Upper and middle-class women gave birth at home, surrounded by curtains, servants, and varying levels of medical ignorance. The term confinement referred not just to the act of giving birth, but to the weeks of isolation beforehand, during which a woman was kept out of public view like a contagious secret. Men were excluded from the process. Fathers were expected to pace, pray, or wait in another room until summoned for applause. Their emotional or physical presence was neither expected nor encouraged. Midwives were the standard care providers for most births, especially before male doctors entered the field in larger numbers during the mid-19th century. These women varied widely in experience. Some were skilled and compassionate, others were gossipy neighbours with towels and opinions. Pain relief was minimal and controversial. Chloroform and ether became available in the mid-1800s, but many doctors refused to use them, citing both moral reasons and royal precedent. Queen Victoria famously used chloroform during the birth of her 8th child in 1853, a scandalous move that led to headlines like, "The Queen has condescended to suffer less." Even when available, anaesthesia was often withheld from poorer women and discouraged altogether by religious authorities, who insisted that pain during childbirth was a divine punishment inherited from Eve. Medical intervention during labour often made things worse. The unwashed hands of physicians were a major contributor to puerperal fever, a postpartum infection with a horrifying mortality rate. Ignaz Semmelweis, who discovered the connection between hygiene and maternal deaths, was ignored and mocked for decades. One woman, writing in her journal in 1864, described her experience like this: "They gave me laudanum and removed my corset. I felt nothing but heat and terror. The child was born blue and silent. He lived. I did not for many days. Recovery was expected to be quiet, tidy and short. Within days, the new mother was required to resume light social duties, receive visitors, and begin the moral and physical training of the child, even if she could barely walk across the room. Because in the Victorian imagination, motherhood was sacred, but only if it was performed without visible blood, complaint, or need. And once you'd done it once, of course, it was only a matter of time before you'd be asked, politely, over tea, whether it was time to give the child a sibling. Congratulations, you've given birth, survived, and now, brace yourself. You will be handed the ultimate honour, supervised visitation with your own child. The baby lives in the nursery now. You live everywhere else, ideally downstairs and out of the way. The nursemaid, who has the temperament of a constable and the arms of a blacksmith, greets you at the door like she's checking for contraband. You may enter, she says, as if you're trying to see the Queen, not your own son. Inside, everything smells like milk and boiled flannel. The baby is clean, fed, and dressed better than you. He is sleeping, or not sleeping. It doesn't matter. You may look, but don't touch anything without approval. Your job is to gaze maternally, say something gentle like, "My, how he grows," and then quietly excuse yourself before you upset the schedule. You're not nursing. That would be improper, exhausting, and, worst of all, natural. A wet nurse has been hired. She arrives like a walking barnyard hymn, full of energy and milk you can only dream of. You smile at her the way one smiles at someone who is both indispensable and slightly too familiar with your baby's mouth. When your child cries, someone else picks him up. When he coos, someone else hears it first. When he spits up, someone else wipes it away with professional speed and no visible judgment. You, meanwhile, write thank you notes and maintain a glowing complexion for the next round of house guests. Motherhood, as it turns out, is not about raising the child. It's about being seen near the child, preferably with gloves on and no spit stains. You are praised constantly. "She's such a lovely young mother," they say, while the nursemaid burps your legacy in another room. You nod graciously and try not to scream into the lemon biscuits. In the Victorian era, upper and middle class women were expected to be mothers in name, but delegators in practice. The ideal was a domestic goddess who bore children gracefully, raised them morally, and never allowed child-rearing to interfere with her appearance, her parties, or her husband's digestion. The nursery, often located on the top floor, was the domain of the nursemaid or monthly nurse, who handled feeding, bathing, sleeping schedules, and early education. Mothers were encouraged to be emotionally available but physically distant, to preserve both their beauty and their sense of decorum. Breastfeeding was considered lower class, or even animalistic. Among the gentry, hiring a wet nurse was common, often a working-class woman who had recently given birth herself and was healthy, sober, and, ideally, discreet. Some medical professionals warned against it, citing hygiene concerns, but social norms typically won out. As the Mother's Medical Guide, 1868, wrote, "Let the upper-class lady not diminish herself by overexertion. The duties of mothering must be exercised with dignity and moderation, lest she become coarse in temperament." Victorian women were expected to balance visibility and detachment, to love the child, certainly, but at arm's length and with clean cuffs. A mother who seemed too involved might be seen as indulgent. One who wasn't involved enough might be deemed cold. Either way she was judged. Real letters and diaries reflect the disconnect many women felt. One 1872 entry from Lady C reads, "My son now takes food from Mrs. G-, our nurse. I am told he thrives. I watch them from the doorway. He cries and quiets for her alone. I feel he is mine, but also not mine." This paradox, expected to feel deeply but never show it inconveniently, shaped generations of Victorian mothers. Their children knew them as elegant, composed figures who arrived in the nursery on schedule and departed before anyone needed to be cleaned, because motherhood was sacred. But sacred things were not meant to get messy, and next week you'll be expected to rejoin society, take the air, attend a luncheon, maybe even bring the baby. For show, of course. Just make sure he doesn't cry, or sneeze, or breathe too loud near the table linen. You're told it's time to take the air, which is Victorian for put on every piece of fabric you own, strap a baby to your chest, and march through public gardens like a one-woman morality play. The baby is dressed like an overstuffed lace pudding. You're dressed like a sofa in mourning. Together you resemble a parade float built by someone who has never seen a baby, airflow, or comfort. There is no stroller. Strollers are for working-class women and scandal. You must carry the child in your arms, with the serene expression of a Madonna painting, and the upper body strength of a circus performer. Your spine files for divorce somewhere around the third lamppost. People watch you as if you're trying to sneak contraband across the lawn. Women glance over their parasols. Men tip their hats, then whisper to each other. Children point. Somewhere in the hedgerow, someone is almost definitely judging your lace trim. A woman approaches and peers into the bundle in your arms. "He's a hearty one," she says, which is the Victorian version of "that baby looks like he eats bricks." You smile. What you want to say is, "He's been fed by a woman I'm not allowed to speak to directly, and I haven't slept since the Queen had bangs." But instead you say, Yes, we're terribly proud, which is Victorian for please let me collapse behind this rhododendron in peace. Then the baby sneezes, loudly, in front of witnesses. You prepare to be burned at the social stake. You dab his nose with a monogrammed handkerchief and keep walking, gracefully, painfully, like a woman who's expected to radiate maternal warmth while sweating through 6 petticoats and possibly hallucinating bees. For Victorian women, re-entering society after childbirth was not a question of readiness or recovery. It was a performance. Public outings with a child, walks, garden visits, carriage rides, were opportunities to demonstrate maternal virtue, social grace, and class superiority, all while pretending none of it was exhausting. Children were expected to look immaculate. Dirty booties or stained lace could suggest domestic chaos. A sniffle, a sunburn, or, God forbid, a cry in public could invite quiet condemnation. As the Ladies' Gazette of Fashion warned in 1867, the child must be a reflection of its mother's management. To appear pale, unruly, or dishevelled is to dishonour the home. The child, in many cases, was still being raised primarily by a wet nurse or nursemaid. The mother's job was symbolic, to look as though she was deeply connected to the infant without actually being responsible for any of the sticky parts. Pushing a pram or perambulator was frowned upon by the upper class. It was a middle-class practicality that implied physical labour. Instead, women carried their babies or had them transported by nursemaids walking a few paces behind. This created a tiered display, mother in front, baby visible, servant silent and useful. It was not a stroll, it was a living portrait of propriety. Every move was observed. Ladies judged each other's clothing, posture, and perceived control over the child's behaviour. Mothers were expected to be pleasant, modestly fashionable, and slightly aloof, visibly present but never flustered. If a baby cried, some women would discreetly hand the child to the nurse and adjust their gloves instead. As one diary entry from 1873 puts it, "I walked with Henry in the rose gardens. Nurse trailed behind. A lady commented on his cheeks. I thanked her. He sneezed. I feared she might speak again. I prayed for rain." To be a good Victorian mother in public was to appear endlessly gracious, lightly maternal, and absolutely free of effort. To do less was a scandal. To do more was unseemly. And as you arrive home, cheeks flushed, gloves damp, and spine permanently bent, your maid informs you your sister-in-law has arrived. Unannounced, with her own child, wearing the new French bonnet. You have survived childbirth, an event so dramatic it should come with a medal, a parade, and lifetime exemption from dinner parties. Instead, you're rewarded with a single delicate question from every visitor. So, when will we see you in society again? Not if. When. Because nothing says, "Congratulations on your traumatic medical event," like an invitation to squeeze back into a corset before your stitches have healed. You look in the mirror, your body is still a battlefield, your emotions are custard, and your corset is hanging on the chair like a predator waiting for its moment. Your maid suggests a gentle lacing, the Victorian equivalent of just one more push-up. You try it. It creaks ominously, like a ship about to sink. You laugh so you don't cry, then stop laughing because laughing hurts. Your sister-in-law visits. She claims she walked it off after her own confinement, as though childbirth is a light ankle sprain. She sits there, glowing smugly in a brand new gown, sipping your tea, and you fantasize about dropping a scone on her bonnet and calling it an accident. Your husband smiles and tells you that you look exactly the same, which is a sweet lie and also a trap, because if you don't, you've failed. You thank him anyway, because the alternative is to tell him you bled on a monogrammed pillowcase this morning and still managed to plan his supper. By week 3, you're back to approving menus, inspecting linens and hosting visitors, all while pretending you're not one loud sigh away from collapse. You've perfected the new Victorian skill, smiling attractively while falling apart internally. You're now officially a wife again, not a recovering mother. The tea tray is polished, the baby is silent upstairs, and your corset has reclaimed its throne. Victorian society expected new mothers to recover quickly, quietly, and attractively. There were no postpartum leaves, no support groups, and very little understanding of mental or physical recovery. A woman might be praised for enduring childbirth, but the applause was brief. Beauty, discipline, and social performance were expected to resume almost immediately. The lying-in period, a short stretch of bed rest after birth, was considered ample recovery time, after which the new mother was expected to return to household duties, social calls, and public appearances, often while still bleeding and sleep-deprived. Corsets, already worn daily, were tightened again mere days after birth. Medical texts warned against the dangers of lacing too soon, but social pressure rarely listened to science. A fashionable figure was seen as proof of moral strength, while physical signs of maternity, softness, fatigue, body changes, were to be hidden at all costs. In her 1875 diary, one woman wrote, "The cook asks if I shall take tea on the lawn today. I cannot feel my legs, but have said yes. I have powdered my face and fastened my bodice. If I faint, please place me near the lilacs." Melancholia, what we would now call postpartum depression, was almost never discussed. A mother who showed signs of emotional struggle might be labelled hysterical or overwrought. Prescribed treatments included rest, laudanum, or being told to count one's blessings in better lighting. Childbirth was sacred, but postpartum bodies were inconvenient. You were expected to forget the trauma, tidy the nursery, and look good doing it. Because in Victorian society a woman could survive childbirth, but she must do it gracefully and with her waistline intact. Childbirth was sacred, but postpartum bodies were inconvenient. You were expected to forget the trauma, tidy the nursery, and look good doing it. Because in Victorian society a woman could survive childbirth, but she must do it gracefully and with a radiant complexion. And just as your stitches start to settle, someone will politely suggest you try lemon juice, arsenic powder, and a touch of ammonia to bring back your glow. Your mother peers at you over her teacup and says, "You look tired," which is Victorian code for fix your face before someone notices you've recently been human. So you begin your toilette, not to improve, but to erase evidence of survival. First, the skin. Pale is the goal, but not the kind of pale you actually have. Blotchy, post-childbirth pale. No. What's required is the luminous pallor of a woman who has never done anything more strenuous than faint attractively. You dab on arsenic powder, just a light layer because the heavy-handed approach ends with you glowing in the wrong way. Then colour. Rouge is scandalous, so you pinch your cheeks until you look like you've been politely slapped. For lips, you bite them until they sting, then smile like nothing happened. If someone asks, you say you were just out in the air. The lie is as transparent as your powder, but that's the point. Next, teeth. Yours are a shade best described as English countryside fence. The solution? Burnt breadcrumbs ground into a powder that tastes like despair. You scrub, wince, and tell yourself it's worth it for the half-smile you'll be permitted to show at tea. Finally, the hair. 100 brush strokes, a splash of cologne that smells like boiled violets and regret, and a curl singed into place with an iron heated just hot enough to set the curtains on fire. You pin it all up, praying it won't collapse into a sweaty halo halfway through supper. The mirror reflects a pale, polished, delicate creature. A woman who appears to wake naturally rosy, bright-eyed, and faintly lemon-scented. In reality, you've just poisoned your pores, burned your scalp, and sandpapered your gums, but you look effortless, and that's all that matters. In Victorian England, beauty was a paradox. Women were expected to look natural, but never plain, polished, but never painted, youthful, but never obvious about trying. The result was a culture of discreet, damaging, and often poisonous grooming practices masquerading as a little cold water and good breeding. Pale skin was the ultimate beauty standard. It signified wealth, purity, and the luxury of never needing to labour outdoors. Women used arsenic wafers, vinegar-soaked cloths, and lead-based powders to achieve the look, all while claiming to do nothing at all. In The Art of Beauty, 1874, one author wrote, "No true lady requires artifice, save for a dab of cold cream and a brisk walk. But should the skin appear blotchy, arsenical face lotions may restore grace, when used in utmost moderation." Rouge and lipstick were associated with actresses and prostitutes, but still widely used. Women pinched their cheeks, bit their lips, or applied small amounts of homemade tints in secret. Etiquette books recommended subtle enhancements and then immediately warned that visible makeup would make you unmarriageable. Hair care was no gentler. Daily brushing was encouraged, ideally 100 strokes, to distribute natural oils, but many women also used dangerous dyes to cover greys or add shine. These included lead acetate, black hair dye, sulfur compounds, ammonia rinses mixed with herbs or lemon juice, burnt matches for eyebrow darkening, pomades made with lard, beef marrow and perfume. Even mouth care was more alchemy than hygiene. Tooth powders included brick dust, salt, charcoal and sometimes crushed bone. Commercial breath fresheners could contain formaldehyde, alcohol or opiates. Yet the goal wasn't just to be beautiful, it was to be effortlessly beautiful. Any sign that you were trying undermined your virtue. One 1863 diary entry read, "Mrs. Bell looked ghastly today. Either she is with child or has taken to rouge, both equally shameful." And once you'd completed your full morning routine, washed, scrubbed, plucked, powdered and pinned, you were expected to pour tea with grace and deny ever touching a mirror. Because true beauty was silent, poisonous and utterly invisible, which coincidentally is also how many women were expected to behave in the bedroom. The candles are blown out, the curtains drawn, and suddenly you find yourself in the marital bed, which is less a place of romance and more a government office for producing heirs. Your husband looks pleased with himself. He always does. You, meanwhile, have been coached since girlhood that a good wife greets intimacy with the enthusiasm of a polite cough. Your job is to lie still, breathe softly, and radiate the kind of modest reluctance that says, "Oh no, not me," while quietly hoping it will be over before the pudding sets downstairs. You do not undress fully. That would be scandalous. A proper lady performs her duties with at least one layer of flannel between her and damnation. He, of course, disrobes like he's conquering Rome. You keep your eyes politely shut as if this is happening to someone else. And then, the grand performance. He sighs, he sweats, he congratulates himself. You stare at the ceiling and mentally review tomorrow's household accounts. Will the butcher overcharge again? Should you risk cinnamon in the custard? These are the thrilling thoughts of a woman being told she is the luckiest person alive. It ends, as it always does, with him collapsing into a satisfied snore while you lie there wide awake, corset unlaced, dignity laced tighter than ever. In the morning your mother-in-law will ask, "How is married life?" And you'll smile, sip tea and reply splendidly, which is Victorian for, "My husband thinks my silence is passion. My maid knows better." In Victorian society, marital intimacy was framed as a husband's right and a wife's duty. The legal doctrine of coverture erased a married woman's independent identity, and with it, her right to refuse her husband. The expectation was clear. Wives submitted. Husbands enjoyed. Sexual knowledge for women was minimal, often intentionally so. Young brides frequently entered marriage with no understanding of their own anatomy, let alone the mechanics of intercourse. Some etiquette guides suggested that a woman should not know too much, lest she appear immodest. Medical texts reinforced the idea of female passivity. The physician William Acton infamously declared in 1857, "The majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feelings of any kind." This belief excused men from pursuing their wives' pleasure. It was assumed women didn't want it anyway. Desire in women was coded as vulgar or dangerous. A good wife was modest, reluctant, and enduring. Marital rape was not a legal concept. Until the late 19th century, English common law held that a husband could not be guilty of raping his wife, since her consent was presumed permanent once vows were spoken. Letters and diaries reveal the quiet dismay of women who discovered marriage brought not romance but obligation. One anonymous 1865 diary entry reads, I endure his attentions as one endures a storm. To resist is impossible, to enjoy is unthinkable. I pray for his sleep. Yet intimacy was also tied to survival. Producing heirs secured a woman's position in the household and could shield her from whispers of barrenness, another label that could ruin her socially. So a Victorian wife was expected to glide into the bedroom just as she glided into the drawing room, pale, modest, and silent. Because even here, in the most private of spaces, she was still performing. And while society praised her composure, it also whispered that a truly devoted wife should be expecting again soon. Which is why, before you've even adjusted the pillows, people are already asking when the next child will arrive. You've just given birth? You can still feel the echoes of labour in your spine, and your ankles have not yet forgiven you. So of course, the very first question someone asks, usually your mother-in-law, sometimes your husband, occasionally the maid with suspicious confidence, is, when will you give him a son? Not if, when. You smile politely because screaming isn't ladylike. But in your head you're thinking, when my pelvis stops sounding like a carriage wheel over cobblestones, thank you. Pregnancy is not a medical ordeal. It is your career. Your CV is your womb, and society expects regular updates. Too few pregnancies, you're barren, too many, you're reckless, too quick, shameless, too slow, defective. Congratulations, you've failed no matter what. Your husband, meanwhile, swans in at night looking like a man who's invented fatherhood all by himself. He kisses your cheek, sighs with pride, and considers his duty done. You, on the other hand, are preparing to spend 9 months rehearsing the fine art of vomiting discreetly into a handkerchief while pretending you're glowing. And when you finally do present another child, dread, screaming, and very possibly a girl, everyone will clap, call you blessed, and immediately ask when the next one is due. You're not a woman, you're a subscription service. Victorian women, especially those of the middle and upper classes, were defined by their ability to produce children. Childbearing was not simply personal, it was a measure of social success, marital duty and divine obligation. The average Victorian woman gave birth to 6 to 8 children, though numbers varied widely by class and circumstance. Maternal mortality was high, 1 in 200 births could result in. The mother's death and many more left lasting physical damage, yet the expectation remained firm. A wife must provide heirs, ideally sons, to secure the family line. Spacing pregnancies was nearly impossible. Contraception was rarely discussed, often ineffective, and morally condemned. Condoms, then made of animal gut, existed but were considered vulgar and associated with prostitution. Withdrawal was the most common method, mocked as unreliable and sinful. Diaphragms and pessaries circulated quietly among radicals and women's rights advocates, but access was limited. One 1864 pamphlet, The Wife's Duty, bluntly stated, "The true woman glories in her maternity. She's not for herself, but for her husband and her children. To refuse him is to forget her vows." But this glorification masked brutal realities. Repeated pregnancies, miscarriages, and infant deaths left women physically depleted. Diaries often mention the cycle with weary resignation. Lady Charlotte Coates wrote in 1877, "I am again expecting. George is pleased. I am tired. The doctor warns my strength diminishes. Still, one must not complain. Complaints dishonour the home." The cruel paradox was that while motherhood defined a woman, it also erased her. She was judged by her children's health, her fertility, and her composure, but rarely recognised as an individual enduring staggering physical and emotional strain. And so, many women smiled through morning sickness, fainted through their confinements, and carried on, because society demanded nothing less. Of course, producing heirs was only half the battle. Once they arrived, there was the matter of keeping them alive, and raising them into little models of family virtue, which meant your next performance wasn't in the bedroom at all. It was in the schoolroom, the drawing room, and anywhere your children could be seen. Your child has survived long enough to walk and speak. A small miracle you immediately regret, because walking means falling, and speaking means repeating everything Papa says in front of the vicar. A governess has been hired. She's pale, overeducated, underpaid, and radiates the sort of judgment that suggests she corrects your grammar silently in her head. She teaches French, piano, and how to sit without appearing alive. You supervise by occasionally wandering into the schoolroom, nodding approvingly and fleeing before she hands you a book. Your main job now is presentation. The children must look angelic, sound angelic, and preferably stop being themselves entirely whenever company is present. You line them up like decorative cushions and pray they don't leak jam onto the upholstery. At tea, your daughter performs a wobbly piano piece that makes Beethoven spin in his grave like a rotisserie chicken. You clap. Guests clap. Everyone pretends it wasn't terrible. Then your son, brimming with the innocence of a child who has never learned discretion, announces that Papa snores so loudly the dog howls along. You smile tightly, as though this is a charming anecdote, not a public execution of your dignity. The worst part? None of this is really for them. It's for you. Every curtsy, every "yes, ma'am," every crumb-free scone reflects back on your reputation. If your child is polite, you're a saint. If your child sneezes, you're negligent. If your child dares to have personality, you are a scandal. And so you smile, correct their posture, and hiss, "Say thank you," through clenched teeth. Because Victorian motherhood isn't about love. It's about brand management. Victorian mothers were expected to oversee their children's moral and social development, but not through direct teaching. That task fell to governesses, tutors, and boarding schools. Instead, a mother's role was to ensure the right people were hired, the right lessons scheduled, and the right virtues displayed. The governess occupied a peculiar position. She was an educated woman of gentle birth but limited means, often trapped in a household where she was too refined to mingle with servants, but not equal to her employers. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, 1847, made her plight famous, a woman isolated, scrutinised, and barely tolerated, yet vital to a child's education. Education focused heavily on moral character and social polish. Boys were prepared for school, politics, or business. Girls were trained in accomplishments: music, drawing, French, and etiquette. Academic rigour for daughters was discouraged. Too much intellect could make them unmarriageable. Etiquette manuals made the mother's responsibility clear. As the Mother's Guide, 1860, advised, "Children are the mirrors of their mothers." A rude child suggests a negligent mother, however excellent the governess may be. Public appearances were crucial. Children were expected to perform obedience and refinement at dinner parties, church, or even garden walks. A single display of poor manners could spark gossip that stained the family's reputation for years. The stakes were heightened by high child mortality rates. Even in wealthier families, disease and accidents were common. Mothers were told to bear such losses with dignity. Too much grief was unseemly. Too little was heartless. One diary entry from 1871 reflects this impossible balance. Mary coughed at supper. Mrs. W. looked at me as though I had failed in some maternal duty. I smiled, though my heart quakes. It is ever thus. One must appear serene, even as fear never leaves. Children were not just companions. They were symbols of lineage and proof of propriety. Their health, manners, and eventual marriages reflected directly on the mother. And while governesses might handle the grammar and tutors the Latin, it was the mother who bore the blame if the child picked daisies during church. Because in the end, Victorian motherhood wasn't about raising children. It was about producing respectable adults who made you look good in the meantime. And soon enough, especially for daughters, the question wasn't education or manners at all, it was marriage. And that was a performance you'd be expected to direct with precision. Your child has survived past toddlerhood, which in Victorian terms means two things. First, you've beaten the mortality odds, and second, you now have a walking, talking liability. A governess has been hired to civilise the creature. She is pale, underpaid, and radiates disappointment like a gas lamp. She teaches French verbs, piano scales, and how to sit perfectly still for 3 hours, which, coincidentally, are also the skills you need to survive marriage. You pop your head into the schoolroom occasionally, nodding as if you too understand the subjunctive tense. Your main job is not parenting. Your main job is quality control. You schedule embroidery lessons and moral lectures, then parade the children through the drawing room like trained canaries whenever guests arrive. They curtsy, bow, and recite a poem they clearly despise. You clap brightly, ignoring the fact that one is picking his nose mid-verse. Of course, the children have their own agendas. Your son blurts out at tea that Papa swore at the gardener. Your daughter, asked to play a hymn, bangs out a rendition of something that sounds suspiciously like tavern music. You laugh as though these are charming anecdotes. Inside, you're already drafting their apology letters. Because in this world, a child's behaviour is not about them, it's about you. If they are angelic, you are a saint. If they sneeze, you are negligent. If they dare to speak freely, you are a scandal. So you smooth their hair, smile at the guests, and quietly whisper, "Say thank you," with the intensity of a woman negotiating a hostage situation. Because Victorian motherhood isn't really about raising children, it's about protecting your own reputation from the tiny saboteurs you birthed. By the time children outgrew the nursery, Victorian mothers faced the challenge of shaping them into respectable public figures, not by direct parenting, but by oversight and display. Governesses were common in middle and upper-class households. These women lived in an awkward limbo, too educated to be servants, too poor to be equals. They were responsible for teaching music, languages, history and manners. Mothers rarely taught directly but supervised to ensure the governess upheld family standards. The expectation was clear. Children had to reflect their mother's moral worth. As the Mother's Guide, 1860, warned, "A child's manners are his mother's mirror. A rude child, however schooled, suggests maternal neglect." Public appearances were tests. Children were expected to behave perfectly at church, teas, and social calls. A single misstep, a loud laugh, muddy boots, or too much chatter could tarnish a family's reputation. This pressure fell hardest on daughters, whose behaviour foreshadowed their marriage prospects. They were trained in accomplishments, piano, embroidery, French, and watercolours, not to enrich their minds but to display refinement at gatherings. Too much intellect was discouraged, as it might frighten potential suitors. Meanwhile, sons were raised for school, politics, or business, but their early manners still reflected back on their mother. A poorly behaved boy was evidence of maternal failure, even if he later became a prime minister. One 1871 diary entry captures the tension. At tea, Edward spilled jam on the cloth. Mrs. B raised her brows. I laughed, though my heart quailed. One is ever judged, not by one's efforts, but by one's offspring. Victorian children were not seen as individuals so much as living resumes of their mothers. Polished, paraded and displayed, they demonstrated domestic success far more effectively than spotless linens or a well-risen pudding. And once those children, especially daughters, reached adolescence, the stakes only rose higher. Their education and manners gave way to something even more precarious: the marriage market. Your daughter is finally old enough to stop being adorable and start being marketable, which means it's time for her debut. A word that here means parading her in front of strangers until one of them agrees to buy the whole set, dowry included. The preparations are brutal. She's squeezed into a gown heavy enough to double as fortifications, given gloves so tight she can't feel her hands, and crowned with ostrich feathers tall enough to double as weather vanes. She looks like a very anxious wedding cake. You tell her she's radiant. She tells you she can't breathe. Both statements are true. The debut itself is pure theatre. She curtsies, she smiles, she pretends she isn't about to collapse under 15 pounds of silk and public expectation. The men bow politely while their mothers calculate whether her dowry can patch their leaky estates. Your daughter says nothing of importance, because cleverness is repellent, but she does manage not to faint. This counts as a triumph. At balls, she's trotted out like a prize horse, made to walk in circles, dance when commanded, and avoid eye contact with anyone who looks poor. You hover nearby, clapping like a stage mother, whispering reminders, smile, don't giggle, don't mention books, and for heaven's sake, don't sweat. The truth is, it hardly matters what she does. A good marriage is about connections, money, and how convincing you look when pretending your daughter's chin is a family heirloom. Once she's secured, she will vanish into another household, where she will be congratulated, corseted, and promptly transformed into another silent air factory. And thus, the grand circle of Victorian womanhood completes itself. Raised, displayed, married, erased. You sip your punch, beam at the happy couple-to-be, and wonder if perhaps the family spaniel might have had a better life after all. For Victorian daughters, adulthood meant entering the marriage market. Debutante balls, social calls, and carefully arranged introductions were all designed to secure husbands of appropriate status and income. The London season was the highlight, a months-long parade of balls, parties and dinners, where young women were displayed to eligible men like well-groomed collectibles. Debutantes were formally presented at court, often to Queen Victoria herself, in elaborate gowns and ostrich feather headpieces. The ritual symbolised their readiness to marry. Etiquette was ruthless. A girl must dance when asked, but not too much with one man. She must be charming but not forward, educated but not intellectual, attractive but not gaudy. A single faux pas, laughter too loud, hem too short, or rouge too obvious, could damage her chances. Dowries played a decisive role. Wealth could elevate a plain girl, while a small dowry might doom even a beauty. Marriage was an economic transaction cloaked in the language of romance, with families negotiating alliances as carefully as business contracts. As one biting commentary in Punch, 1862, quipped, "The daughter is exhibited as though in a shop window. One must smile, one must curtsy, and one must fetch a fair price before she wilts." Once married, a daughter effectively vanished into her husband's household. Her role shifted instantly from ornament to reproductive duty, and her mother's job was considered complete. This cyclical process ensured that generation after generation of Victorian women endured the same performances: groomed, presented, married, and silenced. A diary entry from 1875 captures the resignation. Anna made her curtsy at court today. She was nervous but beautiful. Tomorrow she will be courted, bartered, and soon married. I pray her husband is kind, though such prayers are rarely answered. And so the wheel turned. Mothers trained daughters for the very system that had confined them, hoping for good matches, whispering polite encouragements, and smiling through their own quiet despair. Because in Victorian England, being a woman was less about living a life, and more about performing one flawlessly until it ended. And now, as the final corset laces loosened and the parlour glows with the warm haze of arsenic powders, lemon rinses, and one particularly judgmental governess, I hope this ridiculous little stroll through Victorian womanhood lingers, like the scent of lavender sachets hiding hairpins, secrets, and sighs in equal measure. You've survived drawing-room duels, dinner-party diplomacy, arsenic masquerading as makeup, and more lessons in accomplishments than any person should have to fake. But for now, it's time to rest. The gloves are folded, the governess is off duty, and your daughter is gently snoring upstairs, blissfully unaware she's about to be polished and presented like fine china next season. If you're still awake, impressive. You've just endured the Empire's most elaborately dressed attempt at pretending women were delicate angels rather than unpaid household managers, and you didn't even get a pamphlet, a fainting couch, or a congratulatory biscuit. Hit subscribe so we can slip into another tale of lace-line survival tomorrow night. And as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will carry you deeper, far from corseted postures and whispered judgments, and into sleep.